So what I want to do for this first video, now that the crab is basically done, right? The model is done. It's been subdivided. Is I want to start to go over UV unwrapping with you. We're not going to UV unwrap the armor yet. We'll kind of just unwrap the body, and then we'll kind of unwrap the armor later on. So one of the big questions is, what is a UV map? What is a UV unwrapping? Well, UV unwrapping is the process of taking a model and giving it another set of kind of, if you will, vertices or polygons, right? But these are not identical, but very similar to the actual model, right? Because the thing about textures, whether you're eventually sculpting and baking down to a normal map or a displacement map, or just painting a texture itself, which we're going to be doing all of that in the next several weeks, is your textures are two-dimensional images, right? So a JPEG, a PNG, a Targa could be an actual texture. So your textures in and of themselves at the end of the day are square pictures, right? Two-dimensional pictures. So what UV unwrapping is it's basically taking your model and it's turning it into a two-dimensional version of itself. It doesn't get rid of this one. Like I said, it's like it creates another geometry that you can then do what we call unwrap. Basically, you can kind of peel the skin off and lay the skin to be kind of flat and two-dimensional, so that a texture will actually know where to put the colored pixels somewhere on the model, right? So that is the process of texture painting and UV unwrapping. In fact, that's what we call it, UV unwrapping. You'll see there's actually a little menu up here called UV Editor, right? Kind of our workspace is up here, UV Editing. We're going to be seeing this in a few minutes, right? So the very process of UV editing is, like we said, the process of creating another set of geometry and kind of peeling that geometry off to be two-dimensional. It's still connected to this real geometry, but it is, like we said, kind of peeled up to be two-dimensional, flattened, kind of like a bearskin rug, right? Or if you want to think of it like a label, right? When you kind of peel a label off of a water bottle or a soda bottle or whatever, right? The label really started off as a two-dimensional sticker that you wrap around the bottle, and it's got like a seam, right? And you kind of peel it off at that seam so that you peel the label off and make it two-dimensional again. You can even think of clothing, right? Clothing really starts off as two-dimensional pieces of fabric that you then kind of sew together, right? You can look at seams on your shirt, on your pants, right? And that's what we're doing, is we're taking a three-dimensional model and we're going to put some seams on it so we can kind of peel the skin off and take that skin and kind of flatten it down two-dimensionally and kind of try to smooth it out and de-wrinkle it as much as possible, right? So what does UV mean? Nothing, right? Always in any of my classes, whether it's my Lathrop classes here or my college classes, somebody always goes ultraviolet, right? Because that is a spectrum of light. It's one of the wavelengths of light, right? And that is true in that scientific, physical sense, that it's a property of light. But for us, UV is actually, all it means is X and Y, or in the case of Blender, X and Z, but in two-dimensional texture space, right? So UV really just means kind of X and Y, or X and Z, in UV space. So when you see UV, it's really just X and Y, or X and Z. It's just another way to indicate, hey, this is an axis and this is a different axis. So UV itself doesn't really mean anything, just kind of dimensions in texture space. But we call them UVs so that we differentiate them from the normal X, Y, Z Cartesian space of our normal 3D environment. So that's really what we're doing, is we're just kind of unwrapping, peeling this model off. It helps for us to have a distortion grid. And Text Tools makes that quite easy, but I want you guys to learn how to kind of do that without that first, right? And it'll be pretty easy on this project. So what I want to do is I want to start to show you guys the UV unwrapping process for this. Now, I think in this case I might actually do the armor first and then the body second, because it'll take a little longer to do the body, and it might be easier to ease you in with the armor because it's a bit simpler. So that'd be a great place to start. So in this case, remember your collection over here, there's this little menu. That's your crab body. We can just turn the eyeball off of that, right? So that eyeball controls its visibility, so we don't have to see it anymore, right? And in this case, I really want to UV unwrap in half. It's going to make our life a bit easier to just UV unwrap half mirrored over, and we can actually have our texture be the same on both sides. But what that does, it also makes it so that you can have a texture at half the resolution look like it's twice the resolution. So we're just going to unwrap in half and leave those UVs on top just because it'll be give us more bang for buck. It'll be more efficient for video games. So in this case, I've got the crab gear selected. I'm going to hit 3 for face mode, right? 3 for face edit mode. And from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of half of this, right? Now in this case, I have no more modifiers, right? I got rid of those. So how do we get rid of half of this quite easily? Well, it's actually quite easy if we just use some of the selection tools we've already started talking about. And this is a great way to reinforce those things. So remember, in this case, I'm just in face selection mode, 3 for face edit mode. Remember, if you double-click basically close to an edge perpendicular to the way you want to select, like right here, it selects a face loop, right? If I was to, like, say, double-click on this edge, you see how it selects the face loop that way? So initially, last year, I kind of thought the face loop selection system was kind of lame in Blender, but then I figured out how to properly use it just by clicking closer to the edge, and it now works super predictably, and it's really, really awesome, actually. So super easy to select face loops. This is double left click, just like an edge loop is, right? Remember, if you're in edge selection mode and you double click on an edge, it selects an edge loop. Same thing with the face loop, except you just kind of click on an edge kind of perpendicular to the direction, right? Remember, perpendicular is kind of at a right angle. So if I hold down Shift, remember Shift adds to selections. If I hold down Shift, double left click on this edge, it selects that face loop. And then, of course, we can hit Delete on our keyboard, and it brings up our delete menu options, faces. And now there is kind of a seam down the center here, so these are separated, right? So even though they're one object, they're no longer connected to each other. There's no more polygons connecting them. So if I select a face here, and then we just go to Select menu, remember there is Select Linked, right? And I've already set some quick keys up for it. And that just selects the connected ones. So these are actually really, really useful. But remember, your select tools are in here. So you can invert selections, select all, more and less, or up and down arrows, select loops, right? Edge loops and edge rings there. In this case, I want to select linked, right? So you can just click on that, and then I can use the quick key I set up Z. Boom, select linked, really easy. But it is in the select menu, select linked, and it just selects the connected polygons. And because there's now a gap here of polygons we've deleted, even though they're one object, they're no longer connected. So I'm going to hit delete on that and hit faces, and now we have half of it, right? Now in this case, I'm going to go to the UV editing workspace, right? Because what this is going to do is you'll see our normal 3D space and our normal 3D environment, but you're now going to see over here this, right? And this is basically, you can see, our kind of default 2D UV texture space. So you can see we're going to take this 3D model and we're going to unwrap it to be two-dimensional here, right? Now, this is quite easy in Blender. Blender's quite good at it. One of the things you'll also notice is usually when you go from like modeling to UV editing workspace, it kind of changes this to go to a preset. So you see, instead of being in the modifier, which is the blue wrench, we're now kind of in the some of the object properties, right? It's object data properties. It's the little green triangle down here. And you'll see there's an area called UV maps. So I'm going to click on this to open it up. And there's our UV map. Now, I'm just going to double click on that, and we can name this crab here. So that way we've got a specific name for these UVs. Now, how do we set up UVs in Blender? It's actually quite easy. The biggest thing we need to do is mark a seam, right? We need to mark a seam. And that's where it's going to cut from, right? So it's like a seam on clothing. It's going to cut from there, and then it can kind of peel these different parts off. So how do we select seams? Well, 2 for edge mode, right? So 2 for edge selection. And then all you have to do is double left click on kind of like an edge right about here. And you see how it selects this edge loop through there. Now we do want one on the back also here, right? So I'll hold down Shift, double left click there, right? So remember, double left click selects an edge loop. Shift, double left click selects another edge loop, right? Because the double left click selects edge loops, but Shift allows you to add to selections. In fact, if you hold down Control and double left click, it deselects an edge loop, right? So Control double click will deselect an edge loop. Control is your deselect, right? So Shift and Control can add and subtract to selections, and then double left click is just your select edge loop. Now there's a hole here, so we don't have to worry about that. But that's basically the seams we want for this. Those should work pretty well. If we need to, we can always add another seam as we go and we check it. But I want to mark these as seams. So if you right-click in your UV editor area, you'll see towards the bottom here is an area called Mark Seam. So this is just right-click, and it brings up your Edge context menu like it normally would for stuff, right? We've seen some of these tools already. And there is Mark Seam. And now if I click off, you'll see that there's these red highlights. That means we have seams. Now, to unwrap this properly, what we want to do is go to 3 for face mode. Now, we could select all linked, but remember Control A, so if I go to the select menu here, Control A is actually your select all. So if I just do Control A, it selects everything. Now here's the thing is you can actually see now that I've got polygon selected, you can see your UVs here. Those don't really look the way we want them to. So this model already has UVs, but they're poorly laid out, right? They're poorly laid out. In fact, if I was to do a distortion grid for this to check that out, which we'll do right now. So I'm going to go up here to New for Create New Image and see we're in UV editing, right? And it brings up some options here. Now in this case, I'm going to set this to be a little bit bigger. So we'll set this to say 2048, and that's the pixel size, right? 2048, so it's 2048 pixels by 2048 pixels. Now in this case, I'm going to go to the generated type, and what you could do is you could pick a UV grid, right? So you can pick the resolution you want it to generate out, and you can tell it what type, in this case UV grid. And we can hit OK. And what this does, you'll see it kind of throws a UV grid right in here, right? So we got that texture there. One of the things is we're not necessarily seeing it on the model here, and that can be because if I click on the material properties over here, right? So you see how kind of there is the object properties, but there is this little blue, kind of reddish kind of ball. That's your material properties. By default, this is set up to be a principled material, which for some of you guys that remember from last term, this is basically like Arnold's standard surface, right? You have metallics, specular, a lot of great controls. It's actually Pixar's really high-end material. It's a great material system, actually. So that default there, you can pick different ones, but principled is pretty awesome. That's what you're going to use. Now in this case, we've got the distortion texture created, but it's not actually plugged into the color channel, right? So you can see if we click on this little red ball down here, right, because that green one is where we could go into the UV maps and rename the UV map. The red ball right below it is your materials. And there's another way through the shading menu, but we'll see that later on. And what we're going to do is we're going to plug in a base color. Now you see these little dots, right? These are how you plug a texture in. So basically, if you're coming from Maya, like last year a lot of you guys were, these are like the checkerboards of Maya, right? So I'm going to click on the dot for the base color. And you'll see that we can actually pick, that'll actually give us these picks here. And one of the options you will see is image texture. So we'll click on that. And you can always move this over a little bit if you kind of just wanted to see a little bit more of this menu. So image texture is plugged in. Now we can make a new one. We could open one, but you'll see that there's this little kind of browser there, and we can already find untitled. Now in this case, we might not have our proper material shader on here. So I'm going to move this over really small. And your monitors might be fine, right? So you can kind of see right here, we got viewport shading on. We can turn this one on to kind of show us proper texturing. So these are like our little shaders, wireframe, straight shaded, and that's going to be more of your full textured, right? I'm working on the small monitors at home, or not at home, but because my monitor at home is actually quite large, 32-inch. I'm working on the small monitors at Lathrop. So I kind of had to minimize these. But remember, you can actually grab on the little bars here and make them bigger or smaller, just so I could kind of see this and switch so we could actually see the texture on there, right? So now I can kind of bring these back out a little bit. But you'll see how it's pretty easy to kind of create a new texture from here or even here. And when you click on that base color, you can just pick, like we said, image texture, and then it will allow you to browse for this guy. And you just need to make sure that kind of, textured guy is available, right? So you switch from this guy to that guy. All right. So let me make that a little smaller. Let me make this a little smaller. There we go. So once again, I'll just, I'm in 3 for face mode, Control A to select all. And one of the things you can see is this checkerboard looks horrible on this, right? It doesn't even look like a checkerboard. You see how it's kind of looking like a checkerboard here? That's why we like putting this UV checkerboard on here. It lets us see the distortion. You want this to look like a checkerboard across this whole thing. When it doesn't, your UVs are horrible. They're not going to work well, right? So that's what's going on here, and that's why it's good early on to kind of, create a texture from here, pick the UV checkerboard option, make sure it's plugged in the proper material channel here. Text Tools has a cool feature that makes this even easier to set up, but you see that it's not terribly hard to set up here either, so it's kind of one of those things where not that hard to set up anyways. And it's great for you guys to know how to do this by default, and then we can kind of throw in an add-on on the next project for term 2. But there we go. So now that we have everything selected, we need to unwrap this, right? So what we do is, and I'll kind of maybe move this over a little bit so we can see a little more of this. There is a UV menu here, right? And you'll see right here in the UV menu is something called unwrap. And as long as you have all the faces selected, when you go to unwrap, you will now see that we've got these unwrapped. In fact, if you go to 4 for object mode in here, right, if your cursor's in UV editor, right, 1 will do vertices, 2 will do edges, and you can select edge loops, 3 will do faces, right? And all your selection tools and tweak tools work in here, so tweak and drag select work in here. But 4 actually does your islands, right, where it can select the shells. W can be moved, right, so you can move this, right? But you'll notice that it kind of broke this into 2 parts, kind of a bottom and a top where those seams are at. You'll also now notice this checkerboard looks pretty good, right? That's what you're looking for, right? So you see you make a seam, and that seam allows you to cut it into 2 separate parts. Our crab will be more than 2 separate parts. But that's why I decided we start with this one because it's a little easier to do and show this off, right? But 2 separate parts. But what it does, you see how it kind of peels them off, and it tries to flatten them out and make them quite smooth. So it's kind of like if you were to take, a shirt and you were to cut it at the seams that you kind of find on it and cut it back into its constituent parts, which might be kind of 3 or 4 pieces of cloth. You would then lay them out on the ground or a table, and you try to kind of lay them out as flat and as smooth without any wrinkles as possible. And this is what your unfold, your UV unwrap is doing, right? And Blender, you see, actually pretty easy to do this. It's got pretty darn good, pretty darn user-friendly UV unwrapping tools. In fact, with some of the add-ons on, they're pretty awesome. There's some neat things they can do. Now in this case, I can select both islands. And if I go to UV, you'll see there is a pack UV. The only thing you want to make sure of, though, to see all of this, because you might not see all of these things, is go to Edit, right? Preferences, Add-ons, right? And this is where, and I've kind of talked about this a couple times, I'll kind of talk about it more before we're done this term. I believe UV layout's always on, but just double check that the import-export UV layout's on. I usually make sure to turn on edit mesh tools and loop tools. That gives you some of those other things like circularize that you've seen in some of my menus. These come with Blender. These are all ones that come with Blender stock. You just have to check them on so that it shows them in the interface. And towards the bottom, you'll see something called UV Magic, right? That one definitely is not turned on, so I usually turn that on. So just having some of those on will make sure that you see the same interface here. And you'll see there's an area called Pack UVs. And what Pack does, in this case it really can't pack them any better, but it tries to kind of basically repack them to fit the scene better. And the packing tools in Blender are not bad, but they're not spectacular. And you'll notice there is kind of a little triangle usually on the side here, and you'll see you can kind of go in here and open some of these things up, right? See some of their magic UV stuff, UV manipulation if you want. You might even turn on pack extension, pack UVs, and you'll notice it's not really doing much because it's kind of packed them to the proper size they can be. The packing in here I found is decent enough, but not like super awesome. You could try pack islands here, and I've just found it's not. I find I still have to do some tweaking, right? In this case, I could definitely scale these up. So remember, if you're in object mode, and you'll see they're all right here. Vertex, edge, face mode, object mode. I can turn my move tool on. Middle mouse button for view move. R for scale, middle mouse button for scaling that up. W for move. And you see I'm just kind of moving it, but trying to keep it within this checkerboard. Maybe a little bit of E for rotate. And the pack tools are good in packages, but they're not. I've never found one that's really amazing. Anybody that spent enough time with Maya, my last class, kind of knows this. It's like, it's good enough. But you see how even when we start to kind of run into this, we find that the pack really probably didn't give us that bad of a starting point, but that we might still want to just do a little bit of moving, rotating, and scaling just to maximize it a little bit, right? So you can always use your move, rotate, and scale tools in here just like you normally would. They work exactly the same way. Even your selection tools work the same way. For being object mode will be used as island mode. So it selects a whole shell, a whole island. And we just pack this to take a little more space up, right? You always want to try, particularly for video games, to get as much of the texture space in the UVs. You can't always get every part of it, but you want to try to get as much as you can, right? All right. So that gives us a UV unwrap for that and gets us a little bit of exposure to this. And I'm going to be doing the exact same things on the crab body. So you're going to see all this stuff again in the next video we do. But at this point, I'll kind of just save this just so we're kind of in good shape for that. But that's our first UV unwrapping video.